building.
I mean, every time I'm in, you can see changes, like it's certainly moving in the right direction.
Okay, it's gone 25 to. If you're okay, Eileen, maybe we'll kick off and I'll just introduce you and hand over to you.
Yeah.
Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, to the UAS monthly lecture. Our speaker tonight is Professor Eileen Murphy. Most of you know Eileen already, but for those of you who don't, she is Head of Archaeology and Paleoecology in the School of Natural and Built Environment, Queen's University Belfast. She's co-director of the Centre for Community Archaeology in QUB, which is where I also work. She's assistant leader of the Belfast branch of the Young Archaeologists Club. She's chair of Queen's University Scholarships and Awards Group. She's a vice president of the Ulster Archaeological Society. She's a member of the editorial board of the European Journal of Archaeology, a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of Ireland, a member of the membership committee of the Institute of Archaeologists of Ireland, and a member of the Archaeology Standing Committee of the Royal Irish Academy. Eileen's research focuses particularly on human skeletal remains recovered from prehistoric Russia and all periods in Ireland. She's particularly interested in the uses or approaches from bioarchaeology and funerary archaeology to help further understand the lives and experiences of people in the past. Another of her research interests involves the study of past children and children's burial grounds known as Killeen in Ireland. She is the founding editor of the international journal Childhood of the Past. Further interests that Eileen has include the archaeology of the Irish diaspora and community archaeology. Eileen has a superb publication record, at least 150 articles and books, including Ballyhanna, Life and Death in Medieval Ireland, The Skeletons from Ballyhanna, County Donegal. That was co-authored with Katrina Mackenzie and published in 2018. And an article co-authored with Dr. Colin Donnelly on community-based research excavations conducted by the Centre for Community Archaeology at Queen's University in 2019, excuse me, published in the most recent Ulster Journal of Archaeology, volume 75. Eileen's most recent publication just out is called The Life and Times of Takabuti in Ancient Egypt, Investigating the Belfast Mummy. And that's what she's going to talk to us about tonight. So I'm going to hand over to you, Eileen, please.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Rory, for that lovely introduction. And thank you to the committee for inviting me, and of course to Dr. Duncan Berryman for all his technical assistance, because this is my first time giving a lecture in Zoom. Normally I'm using Teams. So within Northern Ireland, Takabuti needs no introduction. And since her arrival in Belfast, her presence in the various museums has instilled a fascination in the incredible culture of ancient Egypt. And over the years, she's inspired countless youngsters, including myself many years ago, to study archaeology. So Takabuti was a young upper class woman, and she would have lived in Egypt in the 25th dynasty. So that's about 755 to sort of 656 BC. She died when she was in her late 20s to early 30s. Her body was mummified, and we think she was most probably buried in the vicinity of the great religious centre of Thebes, which is modern Luxor. So I'm going to start my lecture with a little bit about Takabuti and how she came to Belfast, and then I'm going to look at the various studies that have been undertaken on her over the years. So her mummy and coffin were acquired by a Mr. Thomas Gregg, who was a wealthy young man from Holywood in County Down, and he visited Egypt in 1834. And unfortunately, there's no records really about this, but we think he was probably undertaking his grand tour. So this was a common educational experience of the upper classes at that time. So they went off to Europe, and some of them went as far as Egypt, basically to expand their outlook on life. Mummified remains at that time, they were highly prized souvenirs, and unfortunately, many Egyptian tombs would have been robbed for the benefit of wealthy European travellers. And you can see just in the picture to the left, this is a very famous sort of depiction of this. So you can see a mummy vendor resting by his wares in Egypt, and this is from 1883. So unfortunately, there was a lot of damage and destruction done to Egyptian antiquities at that time, and including the mummified humans. Now, very thankfully for us, Greg seems to have been quite enlightened, and he actually didn't keep Takabuti for himself, and he donated the mummy and coffin to the Belfast Natural History Society, and thus began Takabuti's connection with Northern Ireland. So just in case you're interested, Thomas Greig, he is supposed to have lived in this house you can see here, Ballymennock House in Holywood, County Down. And interestingly, just from my research, it seems that this house was actually burnt to the ground by suffragettes in 1914, or certainly they were kind of given the blame for the destruction of that house. So after much anticipation, Takabuti arrived on the island in the autumn of 1834, and she was unwrapped on the 27th of January 1835. And at that time, an in-depth analysis was undertaken of her body and her coffin by some of the greatest academic minds of the day. And since that time, she's been a much loved part of the story of Belfast, and she's been a highlight of various museums over the years. So her first home is the Belfast Museum, which you can see over to the left. So this was the Belfast Natural History Society's museum, and it's down on College Square North. So now it's referred to as the Old Museum. And she was curated and displayed here until 1910. And then the Belfast Natural History Society, they actually gifted their collections to the city of Belfast. And she was moved to this building here, the Orange Building, which we nowadays know as as the Belfast Central Library, but then it was referred to as the Belfast Free Public Library, Art Gallery and Museum. So this is on Royal Avenue. So we've got a couple of photographs from her time in that museum. And you can see these were taken by, I think it's A.R. Hogg, so around 1917. So in this picture at the bottom, I should have put an arrow in, but I forgot. So if you look behind, the people on the far right, you can just see Takabuti's coffin in the background. So she's standing upright, and you can see her sort of the facial part of her coffin there. And it seems that the lower part of her coffin and her body were stored separately or curated separately. And we've got this photograph of her, and she seems to have been displayed in a glass case, possibly in another part of that room, which was the Granger room, or maybe elsewhere in the building. So then she moved to, so there'd been a lot of sort of talk about having a new museum established, but there were delays in this happening until after the First World War. And in 1929, the newly opened Belfast Municipal Museum and Art Gallery was opened, and Takabuti again was one of the kind of main displays. So that is the site on Botanic Gardens, which is now what we would more commonly refer to as the Ulster Museum. So just a bit about, her, before we look at her as, her archaeology and her sort of, her as a person, just a bit about, the influence she had on people. So whenever she was unwrapped, she inspired paintings and poetry. And you can see here's a painting up at the top left, which was taken, during her unwrapping. So this, you can see that she's still got all her bandaging intact. And this is really important because we can use this with the museum account or the newspaper accounts to understand what her external bandages would have looked like. So this is thought to have been done by Mr. John Campbell, who was a teacher of painting based in Fountain Street in Belfast at that time. Francis Davis then seems to have been very taken with her, and he also seems to have been at her unwrapping, and he went on to write a poem about her. So he published this in the newspapers, a few days after, or a couple of weeks after her unwrapping. But he also then had it printed on decorative paper and circulated. And these are just a couple of the verses that I thought were really nice. Now in the chilly north you stay, unconscious wanderer of earth, and travellers can scarcely say where stood the city of thy birth. So I kind of like the idea of this poor woman from ancient Egypt being brought to chilly Northern Ireland. But he then went on, years later to he had a book of his poems published, and in this he had another poem about Takabuti, and I think it was 11 pages long and 13 verses. So she really did make a big impression on him. And then as part of our project, we were fortunate that sort of media information about Takabuti from last year resulted in Val Stevenson getting in touch with us. And she had this lovely painting of Takabuti in her attic. And it was undertaken in 1880 by William Dara, who was the son of the curator of the Belfast Museum of the same name. So we thought that was really lovely. And Val has said that she'll be donating that museum. She has that painting is being donated to the Ulster Museum in her will, so it will come to Belfast eventually. She's also appeared in works of fiction more recently, like The Undead of Belfast, which is a horror novel set around in the sort of the 1830s or so in Belfast. So it's quite a fun read. She's been part of a short story collection by Brendan McClaverty. So she's very much a part of the cultural life of Belfast. Now, over the past 50 years or so, teams all around the world have undertaken multidisciplinary studies of mummies. So there have been very high profile investigations of royal mummies, and these have involved, Egyptian scientists and archaeologists, and working in collaboration then with other Egyptologists from around the world. So it was very much within this context of, seeking more knowledge about ancient Egypt and making this available to other researchers and the wider public that the Takabuti project was initiated. And we were very careful to follow, full sort of ethical standards and procedures. So using the latest scientific techniques, we set out to learn more about Takabuti and what she might have been like during life, what would have happened to her body in the aftermath of her death, and then the story of her existence as an ancient mummified Egyptian, in a museum environment. So I really like this. This is a painting. We're very fortunate to have a gifted artist, Libby Mulqueeny, as part of our department in Queen's. So she did a number of paintings of Takabuti and how she may have been in life. And these were based on sort of hieroglyphics, and scenes from tombs and different things. So then we kind of added Takabuti. So Takabuti sort of stands out because of her auburn curled hair. So the Takabuti project then, it had two sort of phases of activity. And I'll explain a little bit about these now in a minute. But one of these was back in 2007 and 9, and then more recently, the project was revitalized in 2018 to 20. So in this lecture, I'm going to give you an overview of the sort of the key findings of the different phases of the project. So one of the things that I've been very struck by, and I suppose this was because, I was looking at the sort of the history of the study, and this was work I did with Winifred Glover. But I think it's, a lot of the questions that were being posed by the scientists back in the 19th century are pretty much the same as the questions that we were posing in the 21st century. So I'm going to just start by looking at, the information they found when she was unwrapped in the 19th century. So I spent quite a wee bit of time down in the Public Record Office trying to find out information about, the unwrapping and the studies. So a lot of what we rely on are from newspaper accounts, but they're very detailed. So this is just one, and this is in a scrapbook from the Belfast Natural History Society, and it's got lots of notices and reports. And, this is where we find sort of snippets of information about Takabuti. So this is the main sort of account from the Belfast newsletter, and it tells us that the hour appointed, 11 o'clock on Tuesday the 27th, about 130 gentlemen attended to witness this highly interesting event, and the most intense curiosity was depicted on the countenances of all present when the president had taken the chair and the mummy enclosed in its case was laid upon the table. So it seems to have been a real event, and if you imagine, there were poets and painters, it was almost a bit like a sort of a media event, our kind of modern day equivalent. So she was unwrapped in the Egypt room of the Belfast Museum, and Dave Tosh from the museum and myself were very fortunate to get a wee tour around that building. And we thought the Egypt room was really lovely because, here you can see it's got a lovely balcony, and we could just imagine, all the people sort of crowding around the balcony, and presumably Takabuti was being unwrapped, in the center of the rooms, but people would have had a good view, because if there hadn't been that balcony, before I saw the room, I was imagining how on earth would they have seen anything, if there's so many of them crowded into a room. So the newspaper accounts basically gave us a very detailed account of the bandaging. They talked a lot about the insect damage, and that there was lots of larva cases discovered. And they actually found a live insect as well. So there was a lot of debate at the time about, where those insects, associated with her from her time in ancient Egypt, or were they a more modern intrusion? So the debates seemed to get quite heated. But I think in the end up, they thought that she had been infested, you know, in the 19th century, and hence why there was a live insect. They tell us that, you know, she was covered over with a kind of a shroud on the outer layers, and then she had lots of sort of inner bandaging that looked quite similar to the modern bandages that would have been used in the 19th century. But as they kind of unwrapped them, they found that they were more and more sort of stuck together with resin, and they had to then sort of cut the inner bandaging. And they also talked about pledgets of material supporting the arms and legs and keeping them in position. In terms of what she looked like, they talked about her hair, and they said the hair was in excellent preservation, being very fine, about 3.5 inches long, forming ringlets like those of children and of a deep auburn shade, with not the slightest appearance of wool. The eyes were replaced by balls of cotton. The teeth were white, regular, and very pretty. And they went on to say that the age of the body at death was probably between sort of 20 and 30. So it's quite a lot of information, and very much sort of focusing in on the bits that we were interested in as well. In terms of sort of the hieroglyphs on her coffin, this man here, the Reverend Dr. Edward Hincks, who's basically one of these people who seems to have been a bit neglected in the history books, because, you know, he's sort of accredited with, I think it's translating ancient Assyrian, and he was very advanced in his understanding of the hieroglyphs of the time, and he's been sort of paralleled with having the same sort of knowledge as Champollion, and he got his blue plaque in Killyleagh, where he was the rector. So Reverend Dr. Edward Hincks gave an explanation of the hieroglyphics and inscriptions. It appears that the inmate of the present one had been at a period of at least 2,000 or 2,500 years ago called Kabuti, and then this obviously was changed later to Takabuti, that she'd been a daughter of the priest of Amun, that her father and mother were both dead at the period of her decease. So he was able to say quite a lot about her in that initial sort of unwrapping. Another thing that sort of attracted a lot of attention at the time was phrenology. So this would have been, you know, very much kind of a technique used in the sort of the early 19th century. And it's basically looking at the shape of the skull. And as you can see from the drawing at the top, they kind of mapped out a person's personality, you know, depending on the sort of lumps and bumps of the skull. So I think it was Grattan looked at Takabuti's skull, and his initial sort of determination was, and he actually wrote a report that's in written format in the Prony. It goes into more detail, but basically he says the phrenological development proved it to have belonged to a person of much firmness and caution of character, and of a high degree of intellectual capacity, but little or no taste. So I thought that was quite funny. And later on, he talks about how she liked children and different things. So, you know, obviously that was a technique that had a lot of validity placed on it at the time, but now we don't think quite so much of it. So then they kind of moved down to her torso, and they removed the sternum and a portion of the ribs. And they said, you know, it came away readily as a consequence of the ravages of insects. The body was found to be filled with a mixture of powders, probably pounded spices, of a very heavy aromatic odour and quite dry in the upper part. I like this little comment. The foot was particularly small and beautifully shaped. And then they say the body was 5 feet and 1 inch long. And we were able to corroborate that as well, you know, just matches what we found too. Okay, so we'll move on now to the 21st century research. And in autumn 2007, Ian Dugan, who you can see here to the left, he was then a director and a producer with Borderline Productions, but sadly he passed away in 2018. But he really initiated a chain of events which kind of has led us to where we are now. You know, he kind of was the catalyst for the Takabuti project. Now he was like me. He was, you know, inspired by Takabuti when he was a child, and he would have visited the Ulster Museum frequently. And he really wanted to know what she would have looked like when she was alive. So he basically set about this program to kind of realize his childhood wish of seeing the face of Takabuti. So when the Ulster Museum closed for a major period of refurbishment in 2006, Ian seized the opportunity then to instigate a program of research on Takabuti, And this culminated in a 1-hour documentary, Show Me the Mummy, The Face of Takabuti, which was aired in October 2009. So you can see this online, and I still think it's very good, but we have updated the findings now in the more recent research. So Ian, he gathered a group of, well, we were supposed to be all experts in our various bits and various areas. So there were people from the Ulster Museum, Queen's, the University of Manchester, and then also Cardiff and Dundee. And many of the people who were involved in this initial phase of research then came back in 2018 and were able to then sort of enhance and update their findings as well. So this initial research, like it did involve radiocarbon dating and stable isotopes from our Chrono Centre, led by Professor Paula Reimer, but I'm going to talk about these in a minute because they've been expanded in phase 2 of the project. So one of the major kind of elements to phase 1 of the project was to get imaging of Takabuti. And this actually involved Takabuti going on a road trip, if you like. She was put on a boat and she was brought across the sea to the University of Manchester and to Manchester Royal Infirmary, where radiography and CT scans were taken of her. And these were under the guidance of the woman you can see in the bottom picture with the purple top. So that was Professor Judith Adams, who now is also sadly passed away. But with her in that photograph is Professor Rosalie David, and Rosalie's been one of the leads on the Takabuti project and the lead from Manchester, and she's also the co-editor of the book with me. And she's a really renowned Egyptologist with lots and lots of books on ancient Egypt. So she's been a wonderful person to work with. And you can just see here's Winifred. You can see the back of Winifred in the pale suit, very carefully monitoring Takabuti being put onto a lorry. And the person with the red hair, Joanne Marshall, is one of the conservators from the Ulster Museum, and they really did look after their charge on that trip very carefully. And you can just see then in the big image to the right, it's Takabuti being x-rayed. And in the bottom image where Rosalie and Judith are, that's her about to go into a CT scanner. So the images that were taken at that time have proved invaluable. And using more modern sort of software, a lot of new information has been gained in the new phase of the project. So when they were originally taken, we didn't know what the cause of death, because just that it didn't show up as clearly in whatever way they were being looked at. It was concluded that her brain hadn't been removed through her nose, which would have been the kind of standard route. So that was considered to be a bit odd. But it was determined that she had been kind of eviscerated, and then that was sort of undertaken through the sort of perineal region, and that's how they kind of filled her body again with the packing material. Now, one of the big sort of finds of that first phase of analysis was a mystery package up in the top left of her chest, and you can see that in the X-ray image up at the very top right of the screen with the big red circle. So this was found sort of on the last day or the last hour of the imaging analysis, so there wasn't scope to do any sort of sampling or anything. But at that time, we interpreted that as the heart, because the heart was a vital aspect of sort of the afterlife of a person, because it allowed a person access to the afterlife. It was a ticket to the afterlife, if you like, and it was needed for the final judgment. So in the sort of the image below at the bottom, you can see a section of the Book of the Dead, which was owned by the scribe Annie. And if you look at that scene, you can see Annie being sort of led to a set of scales by Anubis. And basically what's happening is that the heart represents the soul of the deceased person, and it's been weighed against the feather of truth. And if the heart was heavier than the feather, then the person was considered to be, a bad person. And rather than being allowed to sort of pass on to meet Osiris and go on to all eternal happiness in the afterlife, they were fed to the beast that you can see standing beside the scales with the kind of crocodile head. So that was the devourer. So that's why it was important that the heart was left inside the body so that the person could go through this ritual. So that's why this interpretation that the package was the heart, it did seem feasible. And basically it was the accepted view until the more recent re-examination of the images by Dr. Robert Loynes, which has resulted in a complete reinterpretation of that package, but I'll talk about that in a wee minute. So another key aspect of the early sort of phase of the project was the analysis of Takabuti's hair. And this was undertaken by Dr. Natalie McCreesh, who you can see down in the bottom picture, with Dr. Andrew Geese in Manchester. So they undertook a geochemical and a sort of a morphological examination of Takabuti's hair. It was able to determine that her hair was naturally auburn. So it looks a bit sort of pale and sort of bleached now, but you can see there's a little lock of hair that was cut at the time and was kept in a little glass box. And you can see this in the Ulster Museum, and that's the natural colour of her hair, that sort of auburn. They were also able to say that her hair had been cut shortly, sort of before her death, because if you look at the magnification here in the middle, you can see that there's quite straight edges. So I think the longer her hair, the more recently her hair has been cut, the sharper the edges. We know just from looking at Takabuti that, you know, her hair it's very curled, and it seems to have been deliberately curled using some sort of heated implements that we know the Egyptians had. And the style was then sort of held together with like a natural kind of fatty substance. And it's sort of now up in what we would call like a high chignon. So it's like a big bun of curls, and it's shorter at the front and then longer at the back. So it's a very elaborate hairstyle. And it's quite remarkable because at that time, most people would have had shaven hair and worn the stereotypical black wig, because basically that would have enabled them to avoid the discomfort of head lice. So Takabuti, they found one louse egg and a nit in her hair. So possibly she was infested, but her hair must have been very important to her and a very important part of her identity. And that's why she kept her natural hair and didn't wear a wig. So you can see this is just like a snippet from one of Libby's paintings, and we thought it was nice to have Takabuti getting her hair styled because it was such an important part of her. So one of the key aims, like I said, of the early work, and Ian Duggan's childhood wish was to see the face of Takabuti, and this was very much a focal point of the television programme. So a facial reconstruction was made by Professor Caroline Wilkinson, who you can see here, and Dr. Sarah Shrimpton, who was her student at that time. So there's Takabuti's wee face, and then you can see the facial reconstruction that resulted. So, I mean, there's been mixed sort of views about this facial reconstruction, and, you know, I've made quite a big fuss about her hair, but yet, you know, a wig was put on this particular reconstruction. So that was the way things were done back 10 years ago, but I'll show you the kind of the new version of this in a minute. But, you know, you can see the facial reconstruction just in the top picture. It's now part of the Egyptian galleries. And I think it did serve its purpose very well in the way that it did make people kind of, you know, not just look at Takabuti as a mummy, but think about what she might have been like when she was alive, you know, as a young woman. So it is very important, and facial reconstruction is a brilliant way to connect modern people with people in the past. So, like I said, then in 2018, the second phase of the Takabuti project commenced, and most of the members of the original team were reunited while others joined. And I have to say, the most notable new addition was Dr. Dave Tosh from the National Museum NI. He had been just appointed as the research officer at that time, and then I think he was told to kind of go and get the Takabuti project up and running again. And Dave was fantastic at really kind of pushing the project, and he did an awful lot of work behind the scenes to, you know, to get the necessary permissions for the studies to happen and to enable all the various new samples to be taken. So the remit of the work was very clear. We wanted to tie up loose ends from the first phase of the project. And, you know, at the time we were quite frustrated that we had to sort of pause the work. So it was just brilliant to be able to kind of do this. So obviously we wanted to know more about the mysterious package. We wanted to know more about, you know, was there any evidence for disease in her tissues, any sign of a cause of her death? Because, you know, she was quite quite young, you know, for a sort of an upper class person to have died. We were curious about why she hadn't been mummified using standard techniques. You know, why was her brain not extracted through her nose, and how was she mummified? Is there any more details we could add to that? And we were also then interested in finding out information about her ancestry, you know, because we know, like, there's been such a revolution in DNA studies. We wondered, you know, was it possible to find out anything about Takabuti? So basically, on the 8th of October 2018, the Egypt room in the Ulster Museum was converted into a sort of a makeshift laboratory. And this, you know, poor Dave was tearing his hair out that day because he had so much running around to do to kind of coordinate everybody and make sure that all the work was done, because it was very much a one-off opportunity. So Takabuti was taken out of her glass case, and you can see down here at the bottom, Mark Regan. So he's from Kingsbridge Private Hospital, just up at the top of the Lisburn Road, and he brought down his X-ray equipment down to the museum. So you can see he set up what's called a C-arm image intensifier. So that's the big arm over Takabuti. And you can see then on the screens the images that were being taken. And in the top right photograph then you can see Dr. Robert Loynes, who basically took the samples of Takabuti. So they were taken using this little device you can see up at the top. So I think it's a bone biopsy needle. So the samples taken were absolutely tiny, you know, they were milligrams. He went in through he sort of used the X-rays to guide where he could put his needle in with, you know, and cause minimal damage. And he was able to then, you know, take a little bit of sample from her sort of lumbar vertebrae region, so her lower back region. And he was also then taking samples for DNA analysis. But that aspect of the work required, you know, the team that were in the room to don full kind of forensic gear. So I should have put a photograph in of them in their so they had to wear their masks, they had to wear the full forensic gear, and even like Siobhan here from the Ulster Museum, she was wearing the full gear as well. So I've quite a lot of photographs of them sort of looking like Michelin men and women, you know, in the big suits. But that was absolutely necessary to make sure that there was the least chance of contamination possible. And all of us sort of in around the museum that day, we all had to give DNA samples. So there was no danger of our DNA being misinterpreted as Takabuti's DNA. So also a new sample of hair was taken for isotopic analysis, and a sample of the resin collar, which is around Takabuti's neck, and I'll show you a little bit later. Was also taken, so the nature of this material could be determined. And I should say as well that aspects of this new work were funded then by the Friends of the Ulster Museum. So that was very generous of them. So then over the following year, the researchers worked on sort of processing their results and finding out what it all meant. We had a major milestone in the project on the 27th of January, 2020. So that was the 185th anniversary of Takabuti's unwrapping. And on that day, you know, the members of the team came together, and some of the key findings were released to the public. And the new display galleries, the new display panels in Takabuti's gallery were launched as well. So you can see them in the background in the photograph at the bottom. And there was a lot of media interest at that time in the fact that one of our big findings was that Takabuti died violently, and she hadn't had a peaceful end, which is what people like myself, since I was a child, had assumed, and I'm sure many other people had assumed that as well, because she does look very peaceful lying in her coffin. So we didn't quite make the 186th anniversary of her unwrapping, which is what Rosalie and I would really have liked to do, but all of the findings from the different phases of the work on Takabuti have now been compiled into this new book, and that was just published at the start of this month. So we were again fortunate that we were able to get funding from the Queen's Engaged Research Fund and from other sources that enabled us to publish the book at the price of £9.99, even though it's full colour. And we really hope that this means that the families who visit the Ulster Museum, you know, might be able to afford to buy the book if they have, you know, like an inquisitive 9-year-old like I would have been, and who wants to learn more about Takabuti. So I can remember as a child feeling quite frustrated that there wasn't more information about Takabuti, and I really want, she was sort of this mysterious woman just lying there in this big black room, and I was desperate to know more about her. So I kind of took a wee bit of time, but X number of years later, I feel now fulfilled. I know who she was, or I know a lot more about who she was. So I hope that the modern kids don't have to wait that long. And I shouldn't say kids, anybody, adults as well. So we were very keen to ensure that it wasn't just about the science. We also wanted to, talk about Egypt at the time when she lived, and then also about, what happened to her and how she actually came to Belfast. And just to add, in case anybody's wondering, the hieroglyphs that are at the bottom of the book cover are actually Takabuti's name. So these are taken from her coffin. And we just thought, it's a very important aspect of sort of the Egyptian afterlife to talk about a person's name. So we wanted her name to be there in hieroglyphs, on the front of the book, along with what we think she might have looked like. So what was life like then when Takabuti was alive? So this is work Rosalie David did. She looked at the kind of archaeological context. And basically, Takabuti would have lived in a time of great political uncertainty and upheaval. In the 8th century BC, there would have been a new power emerged in Kush. So this is a region situated kind of in the equivalent of modern day northern Sudan. And they considered themselves to be the heirs of the Egyptian kings who had ruled this area in the 18th dynasty. And they had adopted aspects of Egyptian civilization, even things like building pyramids for royal burials. And they also promoted a sort of a local form of worship of the Egyptian god Amun. So then the Kushite rulers sort of moved to conquer Egypt. And Kushite control of Egypt was finally achieved, and Shabaka established himself as the first king of the 25th dynasty. So there was a lot of cultural recovery sort of followed in the aftermath of this. And it's quite interesting that there doesn't seem to have been any sort of new forms of architecture or anything kind of brought in at that time. And there's actually evidence of kind of archaism. So it's kind of copying older traditions, from older kingdoms. So it's kind of an interesting period. But while all of this was going on, the sort of Assyrians who are kind of up to the north of ancient Egypt, so it's kind of in the sort of modern Iraq region, they were sort of establishing their power base, and they became then a new, very powerful adversary. And they had a very sort of formidable military kind of force because they had enforced military service and advanced weaponry. So initially at this time, the relationship between the Assyrians and the Egyptians was quite cordial, but Egypt had a policy of assisting the client states in Syria and Palestine against the Assyrians. So this then led to confrontations between the Egyptian rulers and the Assyrians. The first invasion then by the Assyrians is recorded as having occurred around 671 BC. And then soon after they took control of Egypt, and that basically is considered to mark the end of the 25th dynasty. So it was a tumultuous kind of time, and lots of political intrigue and violence. So Takabuti herself, then, what would life have been like for her? So she's living in a politically tumultuous time, but she's part of the sort of upper classes. And John Taylor, when he looked at her coffin, he would have said she wasn't at the very upper levels, but she was probably somewhere in the middle of the elite. So she would have had a privileged background. Some of the hieroglyphs in her coffin, they describe her as a noblewoman and a lady of the house. So this indicates that she was married. Her parents, Nesper and Tasseneret, were both dead. And she was the daughter of a priest of Amun, which again would have given her a privileged sort of background. So again, these are just some of Libby's sort of artistic impressions, of what life would have been like for her. So on her coffin, it doesn't mention really anything about her husband or whether she had children. All the focus is on her parents, but that seems to be the standard practice. So I mean, it was very much a multidisciplinary project, and normally this is generally, it is fantastic, and we can get so much information. But sometimes you get contradictory results, which can be then a bit difficult to sort of figure out, what's going on. And you do have to then sort of think about this evidence, in the overall sort of context and in the context of the different types of information. So in 1835, the Reverend Dr. Hincks, he had dated Takabuti's coffin, on the basis of the sort of stylistic features to the 25th dynasty. And this has now been, corroborated by Dr. John Taylor from the British Museum. But one of the sort of complex aspects of the project was the radiocarbon dating, which, as I said, was led by Professor Paula Reimer with Dr. Jennifer Metcalfe from the University of Manchester. Now, radiocarbon dating, it has had its problems in Egyptology, and there's always questions about sort of contamination, which could have affected a sample at any period in its history. And sometimes you get radiocarbon dates that are at variance with other aspects of the sort of historical or archaeological or inscriptional evidence. So you can see here a chart of Takabuti's radiocarbon date. And one of the issues arose because we have a date from the coffin wood, and this seems to sort of be at sort of variance with the other dates, and is a lot younger. So, the sort of the dramatic interpretation is that it's a different, that's not Takabuti's coffin. It's the body and coffin don't match. But whenever you look at how neatly fitted Takabuti is in the coffin, and when you look at all the other aspects of the evidence, that seems very improbable. So we basically think that there has been a problem with the wood from the coffin date, and we suspect contamination. So the resin dates, the hair and the textile all generally kind of matched. So we were happy with those, but the coffin date, as you can see from the graph, was problematic. So we have to kind of be upfront when things don't quite go the way we expect, but that's our interpretation of what might have happened with that. So Paula and Jennifer, they also looked at Takabuti's carbon and nitrogen stable isotopes because we wanted to find out about her diet. They also undertook a sort of what we call an incremental analysis of some of Takabuti's hair. So that was, you can see in the picture to the left, Michelle here in the Chrono Center. She's basically subsampling a strand of Takabuti's hair so that we can then, look at her diet over a period. I think it was about 6 months in the run up to her death. And it was fine because I suppose we thought that if she'd been ill, in the run up to her death, we might have seen a change in her diet, but the results were completely constant. So her diet was pretty much the same. In childhood, Takabuti, she would have enjoyed a rich and varied diet because her father would have brought offerings home from the temple. So that would have been his sort of share of the daily stipend. So once the food offerings had been left on the gods' altars for a certain length of time, the priests were then allowed to take them. As an adult, she probably would have had quite a mixed diet. So she'd have had lots of fruit and vegetables, and the isotopes suggested that she'd eaten a lot of sort of bread stuffs and cereals, mostly sort of wheat and barley. We know that from the River Nile, freshwater fish would also have been available, and meat. Now, most people wouldn't have been able to eat meat. It was only really the sort of upper classes that could have had access to meat. Now, you can see here a sort of a scan of Takabuti's teeth down at the bottom. This is taken from one of the CT scans. Now, we know that a lot of ancient Egyptians would have had a lot of problems with their teeth because the teeth were very worn down. And then that led on to sort of, carious lesions and abscesses and pain, etc. And this would have happened because a lot of the bread that would have been eaten was made on quernstones, and a lot of the grit then from the quernstones and just sand from the desert became incorporated into the diet. So for Takabuti's teeth to actually be so unworn was quite unusual, and certainly our dentist on the project, Dr. Robert Forshaw, was very intrigued, by why she had such unworn and actually healthy teeth. So in terms of her health status, like one of my roles in the project was to work with Bob and Judith looking at the skeleton of Takabuti to see was there any signs of disease. So we were doing this through the CT images. All we found was that she had lumbarization, so that's just a sort of a minor congenital defect in her lower back. She had an extra incisor, which was really unusual. So you can see in the bottom picture, instead of having 4 little incisors at the front of her mandible, her lower jaw, you can see there's 5. So that was quite unusual, interesting, and that's probably another genetic anomaly. And her teeth were perfect except for this one carious lesion. So you can see basically there's a hole in her tooth where the big red arrow is up in the top picture. But that was it. Otherwise, her skeleton looked perfectly healthy. Professor Tony Fremont then undertook as well discovery proteomics. So this was on one of the new samples that was taken. And this is a very advanced technique. And I think Takabuti was the first mummy that it's actually been applied to. So it can look at the different enzymes and proteins in a sample of tissue. And again, he sort of drew a blank in terms of disease and didn't find any sort of obvious signs of what might have, if she'd had any diseases that might have caused her death or contributed to her death. The DNA was also very exciting. So this was undertaken by Dr. Constantina Druso. Here you can see her in the forensic garb. So you can see totally covered from top to toe, and then all the sort of DNA bits and pieces in the Ancient Egypt Gallery. So Takabuti has an unusual DNA. So she's got a rare mitochondrial haplogroup. So mitochondrial DNA comes from the maternal line. So, and this was H4A1. So previously, this was the first time it was discovered in an individual from ancient Egypt, but it has been identified in prehistoric individuals from the Canary Islands, Germany, and Bulgaria. So that was like a big wow, what's going on? And you can see Constantina and some of the team have actually published a paper then in Scientific Reports. Now, saying all that, if you think back to what I said about Rosalie's work, about the context, Egypt at that time would have had a mixed population, with people from, the Assyrian group kind of from the north, and then the Kushites from the south. So it did have a mixed population. So in some ways we shouldn't be all that surprised, to find somebody who doesn't necessarily have, the typical Egyptian kind of mitochondrial groups. But it was still a really exciting find, and it just sort of adds a bit more to, Takabuti's story. Yes, so like I said, in the new work, we have updated the facial reconstruction. So again, it was Professor Caroline Wilkinson and Dr. Sarah Shrimpton. So you can see, I think it's a much improved facial reconstruction, because again, if you think back to the purpose of a facial reconstruction, it's to create empathy between the audience and the individual and to bring a person to life. So Takabuti, Caroline described her sort of skull as having a soft, slightly upturned nose, full lips with a cupid's bow shape, almond-shaped eyes, and relatively large lower face proportions. So you can see in the new reconstruction, they put in her natural hair, which is a vast sort of improvement from the wig. And they've tried to sort of depict the high chignon style. You may be wondering why she's got grey skin tones. Well, facial reconstruction now has its own kind of ethical parameters as well. And although Rosalie and I were very keen for them to give her some sort of a shade, a skin tone shade, they wouldn't do it because we don't know what shade of skin she would have had. We've got our mitochondrial DNA, but we don't really know what the nuclear DNA is. And they didn't want to sort of give her a stereotypical colour. So she's grey. But they've kind of given her more sort of natural skin tones. And maybe if Constantina does further DNA analysis on her paternal line, maybe we will be able to say something more about her skin. But I think she looks great, even though she hasn't got like a natural colour. Okay, so then another of the big wow factors with this study was the cause of death. So like I say, Dr. Robert Loynes, who you can see here, so he's a retired orthopedic surgeon, and he then went on to do his PhD looking at Egyptian mummies and particularly imaging. So he was able to use more modern software and to look at those images that were taken by Judith Adams back in 2007-8. So basically he identified, if you look at the bottom left picture, that there was a massive sharp force trauma to the upper left back. So you can see there's like a big gash where the ribs and the vertebrae kind of meet. From the shape of the injury, he could see that the central ribs were sort of most damaged in the area, and then there was kind of splintering of the ribs on either side. So this then led us, and Rosalie did some work on this to conclude that she probably had been hit with a concave axe. So you can see here's a drawing of the main kind of weapons that would have been used at that time. So the one that kind of fits the shape of the injury the best is the axe. Now, we don't know who might have wielded an axe, because Assyrians would have used axes, but ancient Egyptians would have as well. But it looks like she was, somebody was pursuing her from behind, and they struck her in the back. So if we return to the package, then this sort of all starts to make sense. And Bob basically explained it as there was a big hole in her back and they plugged it with this package. So if you look at the image down at the bottom right, you can see it's very clearly wrapped in linen, or it's very clearly made of linen, I should say. So it looks like they just had a bundle of linen and they then used that to kind of stuff in around where she was injured. So that was all pretty traumatic stuff. And the nature of the wound, she probably would have died pretty quickly because she'd have had a collapsed lung and then associated catastrophic bleeding. So for all of us who sort of have been working on Takabudi over the years, this was a real shock. And you do look at her in a sort of a different light, knowing that she was the victim, she was murdered. So Bob's work then, he also looked at the imaging, and he was quite excited by the way she had been mummified, because he said it sort of departed from the standard kind of practices of embalming. So excerebration basically is removal of the brain. So normally this would have happened, through the nose and through the kind of the ethmoid bone in the middle. And you can see from the picture over to the left that that's completely intact. And what seems to have happened is that they sort of separated the muscles at the back of her neck, sort of bent her head forward so they could access it through the foramen magnum, which is the big hole kind of where the brain and the spinal cord connects to the spinal cord. And they took her brain out that way. They seem to then have kind of you can see there's still substances inside her skull in that top left picture. So they seem to have put resin and a mixture of some other substance, which we're not quite sure what it is, back into her head. And then her head seems to have been supported by a resin collar. So you can see little bits of the resin in that picture, and I'll show you a more clear shot in a minute. But that's kind of why her head then sort of lolls to the left. Her eyeballs were packed with linen. Now, previously, it was assumed that it was actually her eye sockets were packed with linen, but Bob's work has shown that the soft tissue of the globe of the eye and the optic nerve and all are still there. And it was actually, they incised the eyeball and packed it with linen. So that must have been incredibly delicate work. The heart actually was in her chest. And you can see it very clearly in this image at the bottom, this particular layer. You can see the different chambers of the heart. And interestingly, it seems to have been wrapped in linen. And, Bob has said that he's only come across, I think it's another one or two examples of mummified remains where you've got the heart actually wrapped. So that was very interesting as well. He noticed that her tongue was kind of compressed at the back of her mouth. And you can see in that top left picture that there's a big void in her mouth. So he suspects that there was something placed in her mouth, and it's possible that this might have been removed in 1835 when she was unwrapped, but we can't be certain. And then her torso area, so it's completely filled with packing material. But what seems to have happened was that there was an abdominal incision, and Bob was able to find the edge of that. So it looks like they kind of went in from her abdomen, but also then from the perineal area. And they added the packing through the abdominal incision and then sort of plugged put sort of linen plugs up into the body through the perineal packing, and this had then been sort of sealed with resin. But they seem to have done it a bit too much and packed in a bit too much of the material from the abdominal incision, because the plugs in the lower part of her body had started to kind of come out, and it looked like the seal had even been sort of broken at the time of mummification. So that was a huge amount of new information about the process of unwrapping, or process of mummification. And then Keith White and Bart Van Dongen and Sharon Fraser, they also looked at a sample of the packing material to try to learn a bit more about it. So you can see just in that top right picture, you can see the resin collar very clearly, that sort of dark material in around her neck. In 1835, if you remember, they had said that the chest and abdomen were full of dense and aromatic packing material, and they had suspected it was pounded spices. Well, Keith and his team were able to show it was actually mostly sawdust, and it was mostly from the cedar tree, and there seemed to be then kind of blobs of liquefied pine resin. So it's probable that it was the cedar and the pine that gave her the nice sort of aromatic smell. And Keith suspects that they probably took shavings from the workshops where they would actually be making the coffins, and then use these in the mummification of the bodies. So when we set out to compile the book, we very much did so with the objective of sharing the story of Takabuti, so that those who visited the Ulster Museum could really, have the opportunity to learn more about her if they wish to do so. Because, she's lain in her case for a very long time. She's out of her own time. She hasn't really had a voice, and she's provoked a very human response in people who visit her. And I think this is such a poignant photograph. This is from the National Museum NI archive. And you can see in August 1961, an anonymous member of the public actually left a wee bouquet of flowers on top of Takabuti's glass case. And, this very much reminds us that this body that we're looking at, was a person, is the remains of a human being. And I think a lot of people who go to the museum today, they think about what she was like as a person as well. Now, despite all the effort that the ancient Egyptians went into, in terms of preparing a person for the afterlife, they were very aware that most tombs did get ransacked, and sometimes this happened quite soon after burial had taken place. So once the integrity of the tomb and its contents was broken, their ability to facilitate the deceased owner's eternity was somewhat compromised. And this is of direct relevance to Takabuti's burial, because while we have a suspicion about where she would have been buried, we can't be certain about this. All of the funerary objects that no doubt would have been buried with her, and all of the amulets that would have been associated with her, are long since gone, and now she rests in a museum environment. So the kind of ancient Egyptian sort of protocols, if you like, to prepare her for the afterlife no longer exist. So in terms of Egyptian beliefs, there's no more protection for her sort of physical remains and a residence, for the Ba and the Ka, the different elements of her spirit. But I suppose, fortunately, the Egyptians had another way to ensure that the deceased passed successfully into the next world. And this was very much tied into the person's name. And one of their sort of beliefs was that the more a person's name was repeated, this ensured their eternal existence. And we've even got ancient funerary texts that say, they basically ask the living to say my name and I shall live. So Takabuti very much holds a special place in the hearts of the people of Northern Ireland. And, our work and the resultant book, like I say, was very much, undertaken in the spirit of showing her respect, but also keeping her name alive. And we kind of like to think that this is sort of the modern equivalent of the ancient Egyptian beliefs, because I think, we can be quite satisfied that Takabuti's name has been said a lot, because of this work and because of the book. So just wanted to kind of give a wee plug to an event that's coming up. So this is a free online seminar day all about Takabuti that's taking place on the 8th of May. So I've kind of given you an overview of what it's all about, but on this day you'll hear people talking, the people who basically made the contributions to the book, talking about their kind of specialist areas. So it'll be a lot more in depth, and it's going to have, a lot of recorded talks and then live Q&A sessions. So if you're interested, you can join that, and it's all free because, as we say, this is all about public engagement and about, sharing the information about Takabuti. And then my last slide is really the acknowledgements, because, a project like this involves a huge number of people, funding bodies, the museum authorities, and then all the different specialists. And, I haven't even mentioned there's lots of other people as well, but they're all acknowledged in the book. But, when people come together from different organizations and we can do something special. And, like I say, Takabuti is she's a person, a long dead person who's been part of my life for a long time. And I just feel really privileged to have been involved in this project. And I hope you've enjoyed listening to me talk a bit about her and hearing more about her. And, if you go to the Ulster Museum and see her whenever the museum opens, you can, remember some of this and think a bit more about who she was when she was alive and what actually happened to her, quite tragically. So that's me finished. If anybody would like to ask questions.
Thank you, Eileen. That was fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Takabuti always seems to be with us, and to actually have so much information, accurate and up-to-date information, is absolutely brilliant. Just one wee question from myself, if you don't mind me kicking off. You mentioned that her mummification was quite a rare type of mummification. Any thoughts on why she was mummified? And they obviously went to a lot of trouble to mummify her, but why she was one of the, sort of not one of the usual type of mummifications?
Well, I suppose it could be to do with her status, but my own personal view, and there's no way that we can prove or disprove this, but I kind of wonder, was it because she died violently that she was kind of given more special attention, and maybe, I know there would have been, these priests would have been doing this as their professional work, but maybe there is a bit of a fondness or something in there, that they wanted to make sure she was treated right in her mummification. But like I say, that's totally conjecture and personal view, and I don't know if we can prove it really, or if there's any way for us to answer that question scientifically.
Yes. Just one follow-up question. In the early representations and reports, when she came to Belfast, they call her Cabuti. Was that a misreading of the hieroglyphs?
I think so. I mean, that's something, it's a wee bit hazy. And I've asked, I think it's hazy because in some of the in the 1970s photographs in the museum, you can still see Cabuti written below her coffin. But then I've heard that it was actually Edward Hinks revised the translation, so he was calling her Takabuti. So it just makes it a bit confusing to know exactly when that change happened. But it was all tied into a misreading of the hieroglyphs.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else like to ask Eileen a question?
In ancient Egypt, was red hair a special, give you a special status of some sort? I have a notion there's some mention in the Golden Bough.
Okay, I don't know, Ken. I suppose, it's again, do we think about the Egyptians as all having dark hair, or, I suppose one of the things, especially Constantina, the DNA specialist, was very keen to remind us about the sort of mixed ethnicities in Egypt at that time. So would Takabuti have stood out, or not really, because there were lots of people of different colors of hair, and but I don't know if red hair, I'm not sure if it's mentioned. I'll go and look up the Golden Bough and see what's
it
said.
Might be there. Maybe it was somewhere else, but
yeah, okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Anyone else like to ask Eileen a question? No? Anybody? No. Okay. Well, I think a lot of us will be tuning into that event in May. So thank you for that, Eileen. Look forward to picking up a copy of the book as well.
Thank you.
And so that was brilliant. So thank you very much. Before we go, I'll just let people know that on May the 31st, our next monthly lecture is Gavin Donaghy from Northern Archaeological Consultancy Limited. Take me to church, a look into early medieval enclosed settlements in County Armagh and their associations with early church sites. But hopefully I'll see some of you at the Tagabooty Day on May. So good night, everyone, and thank you again to Professor Eileen Murphy. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Rory. Bye.
Night night.
Good night.
Good
Brilliant.
night. Mm.
That's it.